In the age of information, we've seen the creation of some of the greatest hoaxes in history. Think Jussie Smollett or the mostly peaceful protesters of 2020. With the ability of social media to reach millions, these hoaxes often spiral out of control, and the mass graves of Indigenous children under schools in Canada is one of the latest stories to be exposed. 2 years ago, it was alleged that the mass graves of over 1,300 Indigenous kids were discovered around various Canadian residential schools. However, now that it's been over 2 years, recent excavations have shown that no human remains have actually been found. Now, if you haven't heard this story before, the original narrative began back in May of 2021 after an Indigenous community, often called the First Nations in Canada, announced that they found confirmation of the remains of 215 children, with some being as young as 3 years old, on the grounds of the former Kamloops Indian Residential School, using a ground-penetrating radar technology to find said graves. Pay attention to this tech because it's going to come up a lot. So a little bit about these schools. Back in the early 1900s, residential schools that were mostly run by churches and funded by the Canadian government were set up to assimilate Indigenous children into Canadian society. Now, many Canadians have discussed being taught the history of these schools and how Indian children were taken from their families and faced abuse and mistreatment. However, this was the first allegation of mass graves, and it sent the entire nation of Canada into a frenzy. Now, this narrative was echoed worldwide by various news outlets such as the New York Times, who reported that the mass graves of children were being found around these schools despite no excavations actually being held to ever prove these claims. Seems kind of important. 3 similar announcements of more mass graves at other schools came out shortly after, further confirming this narrative of a mass genocide perpetuated against Indigenous communities. Now, the announcement of these graves resulted in Prime Minister Justin Trudeau ordering Canadian flags to be flown at half-mast until the First Nations decide they could be raised again, which was apparently a record-breaking consecutive 5 months later. The Canadian government also pledged $320 million to help Indigenous communities search more burial sites, on top of another $40 billion to compensate Indigenous people who faced abuses as children at these schools. Then in 2022, the Catholic Pope made a visit to Canada and made an apology on behalf of the Catholic Church to the Canadian Indigenous communities, condemning the deplorable evil that took place and asking for the humble forgiveness for the, quote, evil committed by many Christians against the Indigenous peoples. A response to, again, the definitive reporting that there were indeed these mass graves. Now, worst of all, the announcement of these graves resulted in the targeted attack of Christian churches throughout Canada, which resulted in 83 of them being desecrated, vandalized, or burned to the ground, with as many as 10 churches of various denominations targeted in just one night. And again, at this point, there have still been no excavations to corroborate any of these claims. Now, fast forward to today, yes, 2 years later, and it's starting to come out that, wait a minute, it seems that the ground-penetrating technology that was used to find some of these mass graves isn't so reliable. 14 excavations were held this past summer in the basement of a Catholic church near a former Pine Creek residential school in Manitoba. The Indian community in this area used that same ground-penetrating radar that started all of these claims and found 14 anomalies in the ground which they suspected to be children's graves. But after they conducted their excavation, there was no presence of human remains found.
We are now concluding the excavation of the 14 locations under the church. The archaeological team we hired from the University of Brandon, which is the same archaeological team that is relied upon by regional police agencies when doing archaeological excavations, found no conclusive evidence of human remains in their excavation of the ground under the church base.
This discovery led many to question the mass graves, especially at the Kamloops Indian Residential School where these initial claims began, especially since the Kamloops First Nation said they couldn't say for sure how many potential burials were at the school because they have no intention of conducting an excavation at the site, and there are still none planned to this day. Also, to highlight how out of control this narrative got, the First Nations came out and stated they found 182 unmarked graves discovered near another residential school in Cranbrook, British Columbia, using that ground-penetrating radar. This was another announcement that just added to that genocide and unmarked mass graves narrative, with the local community stating that work had begun to identify whether the graves were those of children forced to attend St. Eugene's, a former residential school in the area. This discovery led to an Indian chief from the area labeling this finding a mass murder of indigenous people, calling for locating the priests, nuns, and brothers who were responsible for this mass murder to be held accountable for their part in this attempt of genocide of an indigenous people. However, the local tribe in this area came out and shared in a press release that the history of the area was a complex one, and that many of the graves consisted of people who passed away at a hospital in the region during that time, or that the graves were previously marked but with wooden crosses that could have deteriorated or eroded over time, making it extremely difficult for them to establish whether or not these unmarked graves contained the remains of children who attended the residential school, or even if they were really unmarked at all. Over the past 2 years, the Canadian government also called anyone who questioned these mass grave sites a denialist, with spokespeople for the burial sites calling denialism the last step in genocide. Federal justices and Canadian lawyers also called for residential school denialism to be added to the criminal code, which could lead to up to 2 years in prison for the willful promotion of hatred. However, there still has been no evidence or excavations to back up any of these claims, and some have been brave enough to highlight the discrepancies in the initial allegations, like a former professor at the University of Montreal who shared that there has never been any evidence of mass unmarked graves that were kept secret, or that there was ever a cover-up of the deaths of Indigenous children. A former Attorney General from Manitoba also shared that evidence does not support the overall gruesome narrative put forward around the world for several years, a narrative for which verifiable evidence has been scarce or non-existent. By the way, this same attorney has highlighted how all Canadians are taught the past of these residential schools and the dark stories of abuse against the students, simply asking if it's necessary to exaggerate claims to make Canada's history uglier than it already is. And if you look at the media's reporting on the situation now that these recent excavations have turned up nothing, they definitely seem to be doing damage control surrounding the initial mass graves claims, with outlets like the National Post writing entire articles now trying to rewrite the narrative around who the original claims of mass graves came from. At the end of the day, we'll never know the truth surrounding these mass graves, since the people and reporters who once echoed these claims are not trying to follow up on whether or not they're actually true. However, Canada has already suffered the consequences of these allegations, and many will continue to echo them for years to come. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff, and click on the links down below to find more videos. I'll see you guys next time.